Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We see that many of you are still coming into the room and joining the webinar, so we will get started in just a moment. Thank you for being with us today. Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Title IV-E Prevention Program and Data Submission. This webinar is brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. We really encourage you to participate in today's webinar. You'll have the opportunity to respond to periodic polling questions, ask questions after the presentation by either typing those questions into the question and answer feature that should be located either at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your screen. You can also ask questions over the phone using the raise hand feature, and the presenter will unmute your line. Please note, if you do use the raise hand feature, we will chat with you privately to be sure you're ready to ask your question live. Just go ahead and confirm with us that you're ready, and then we will unmute your line so that you can ask the question live. If you've called in to this webinar, you can just dial *9, and that will allow us to unmute your line as well. After the webinar, you can continue to submit questions to cbdatateam@acf.hhs.gov. Next, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. You'll hear from Jennifer Haight, Malcolm Hale, and Catherine Kulbicki from the Division of Performance Measurement and Improvement. You'll also hear from Kara Kelly and Dory Snedden from the Office of Child Abuse and Neglect. And I will be your facilitator. My name is Phil Breitenbuscher. Now I'd like to introduce to you and welcome Jennifer Haight. Jennifer?
All right, I'm going to start that again. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Phil. It is really great to be with you all here today. And I just want to take a second to give an overview of what we're going to be doing today and take in a note to say what we're not going to be doing. I just want to be clear that our focus really today is on the IV-E Prevention Program Plan data. So we're not talking about the clearinghouse. We're not talking about prevention plan requirements. Which, if you have questions about those, there are lots of avenues available to you to ask those questions, but I wanted to be clear that today's focus is on the prevention plan data. As Phil said, I am joined by members of my team from the Division of Performance Measurement and Improvement, and we have primary responsibility for managing data collection and reporting related to federal data collection requirements. And we are joined by our colleagues in CB at the Division or the Office of Child Abuse and Neglect. And as you know, they have primary responsibility for working with states who have approved plans or in the process of developing approved plans. So what we are planning to do today is give an overview of the prevention plan, of the IV-E prevention program that will come from our colleagues at OCAN. And then we're going to switch over to review some of the information that was most recently made available in a technical bulletin that was released last month. It was the reissuance or sort of a revision of Technical Bulletin 1, in which we specified what we will be looking for in the data collection associated with IV-E prevention plan data. So in that technical bulletin, as well as the second technical bulletin that specifies reporting submission periods, we're going to be talking about the timeline. We're going to define or explain who is in the reporting population and provide some examples. We will be going over the IV-E prevention program data elements specifically, so that you can see how they are defined and what we are expecting from those data collections. And additionally, we will review the schema and structure for the data collections themselves. Finally, we did receive some questions in advance of this webinar, and we'll be going over those questions and providing answers. And we will also have time, we hope, to take questions that may come up over the course of this presentation. And we will attempt to answer them today, and if not, will certainly make note of them and make those questions available in the near future. And then we will have some resources, and to the extent that there are next steps, we'll talk about those too. So that's the plan for today. We have, I think, sufficient time to go over these things methodically and carefully and accommodate your questions, and that is our intention. But before we get to that, we did want to do a little bit of level setting by asking a few questions of those of you who are joining with us today. We know we have a wide audience, so we wanted to just ask a few questions. So I'm going to ask our partners to help us with the poll. The first question, which is going to pop up, is: have you read the new technical bulletins? And by that we mean the ones that were sort of issued and available on CB's website with August publication dates. So we'll ask you to answer the questions, and when I see that there are, when Bill, if you can let me know when you think that we have enough results to publish, we'll go over them. And also, I'm noting that somebody is saying they're having trouble hearing. Is that, can you all sort of indicate with a thumbs up in the chat if there's, or just if there is a bit muffled? Okay. Okay, so I think we have I think we can close the poll, Bill, and it looks like it's, oops, but I can't see the results anymore. Looks like about half of you have had the opportunity to read the newly issued technical bulletins, and about half of you have not. So we'll keep that in mind as we're going through it. And again, please use the question and answers module liberally so that we can make sure we are able to answer questions that come up. Okay, we do have another question that we wanted to ask of the audience. And that is, where we note that the 4E prevention program is an optional program for 4E agencies. So we're curious to know if your 4E agency has submitted a 4E prevention plan. And we recognize that for some of you, if you are not directly attached to a 4E agency, this may not be applicable, so feel free to go ahead and note that. And so for some of you, you may not know, because that may not be information that is filtered down to you, and that's fine too. But we are curious to know with whom we're speaking today. So please take a second, and Bill, let me know when you think we have the results to publish. Okay, so there are about 14% of you for whom this is not applicable. Just under a third are not sure, don't know. About 45% of those of you are on the phone indicate that your agency has submitted a 4E prevention program plan. So either it's been approved or it's in the process. And the data collection information that you're going to hear today is definitely applicable to you. And the remainder, about 11%, say no. Okay, thanks for that. And then we have one final question, and we really appreciate your participating with us in this way. And that final question, for those of you, obviously, who the 44% who indicate that your agency has submitted a plan, we would like to know if you've started planning for data collection. Again, if it's not applicable, you can say not applicable, or you can just not answer. But for those of you who did answer that your agency does have, has submitted a plan, or you know that they're, and it will be approved or has been approved, could you please answer the question for us? Okay, so I'm going to have to remember. So for a number of you, well, for 13% of the respondents, which I think there are slightly fewer respondents than on previous polls, which makes sense because if you're not applicable, you are not applicable. That's what the 13% is. About 20% don't know, but 60% say that your agency has started planning for data collection. There are close to 200 people on the webinar, or actually over 270 people on the webinar, but not all of those folks are participating in the survey, and not all of them are associated with 40 agencies who might be developing plans or submitting data. But as I said, about 60% of the respondents, or 104 of the respondents, indicate that their agencies has started planning for data collection, and 8% of the respondents, or about 14, say that you have not. Okay, thanks for participating in the polling questions. We are going to move on. I'm going to turn this next section over to my colleagues at OCAN to provide an overview of where we are with 4E prevention programs.
Title 4E Prevention Program Overview.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. My name is Kara Kelly from OCAN with the Children's Bureau. And as Jennifer mentioned, I'm part of a team with our office at OCAN that's part of a larger integrated team working with the Children's Bureau regional offices and OPRE to provide support to states and tribes during review and approval of the agency's Title 4E Prevention Program plan. So to set the stage for today, we wanted to highlight some important components of the legislation related to Title 4E Prevention Services data submission, provide an update of approved and pending Title 4E Prevention Program plans, and describe some details about the timing of data submission. So first, the Family First Prevention Services Act has a number of provisions. However, really for our purposes today, the two most important components are that the legislation revised and reauthorized subparts 1 and 2 of the Social Security Act and created a new Title 4E Prevention Services Program. The Title 4E Prevention Services Program provides optional funding for Title 4E states and tribes under Title 4E. And beginning in October 2019, Title 4E agencies with an approved Title 4E prevention plan have the option to claim Title 4E for a portion of allowable programs and services. In order to be allowable, programs and services must be rated as promising, supported, or well supported by the Title 4E Prevention Services Clearinghouse, or have an approved designation through the independent systematic review process. Next slide. I think we went past one.
Status of prevention plans as of 9/17/2021.
There we go, thank you. So to date, there are 15 states and 1 tribe with an approved Title 4E prevention program plan, with the approved states and jurisdictions including Washington, D.C., Utah, Maryland, Arkansas, Kansas, Kentucky, North Dakota, West Virginia, Washington State, Nebraska, Iowa, Oregon, Hawaii, Virginia, and Maine. And the approved tribe is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians from North Carolina. In addition to states and tribes that have been approved, we have a number of states and tribes that are currently under review. The states include Illinois, Colorado, Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, South Carolina, Tennessee, Oklahoma, New Hampshire, Montana, Connecticut, Arizona, California, Nevada, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And the 2 tribes under review currently include the Aleut community of St. Paul in Alaska and Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community in Arizona. Next slide.
Title 4E Prevention Program Data Overview.
So as part of opting into the Title 4E Prevention Services Program, states and tribes must report data to HHS for each child receiving Title 4E programs and services. Specifically, that information includes services or programs provided, information specific to services and programs provided, including the duration of the services or programs. And additionally, information is required to be reported related to the child's placement status at the beginning and at the end of the 1-year period, and whether the child entered foster care within 2 years of being determined a candidate for foster care. And we'll discuss these variables in more detail later in the presentation. Next slide.
Reporting timeline.
And these data are required to be reported based on the approval date of the Title IV agency's prevention program plan. The approval date is a unique date for each 4E state and tribe. The approval date is included on the agency's prevention plan approval documentation. So specifically as it relates to timing, 4E agencies must begin collecting data starting one full federal fiscal year following the federal fiscal year in which the Title IV prevention program plan was approved. This means a Title IV agency will have the remainder of the current federal fiscal year in which the prevention plan is approved, in addition to the next full federal fiscal year as a planning year to prepare for data submission. The data collection periods all run from October until March, and data transmission runs from April until May, aligned with the agency approval dates. This slide provides some potential examples here of approval dates and subsequent data submission periods and data transmission periods. This information is all outlined in more detail in technical bulletin number 2 that is posted on the Children's Bureau's website. But if you have specific questions about when your state or tribe with an approved Title IV prevention program plan must begin collecting and submitting data, please reach out to your regional office specialist and they can provide some further guidance. And with that, I believe I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm Hale.
Oh, thank you, Kara. Before I begin, a warning that I am at home with a sick child, so there could be some disruption on my end, but hopefully not. So once data collection begins, agencies need to submit all relevant records every 6 months. The 6-month period is tied to the beginning and middle of the federal fiscal year and will therefore match up with the AFCAR submissions. There's a 45-day transmission period that follows each 6-month data collection period. And the table on the screen in front of you shows you the relevant dates. Next slide. So let's turn now to which records are to be included in each submission. It depends on which portion of the reporting population the child is in. Up on the screen, you can see a quick reminder of the 2 reporting populations. There's candidates for foster care and pregnanting or parenting youth. If a candidate for foster care or pregnant or parenting youth was in a prevention plan at any point during a 6-month window, the agency should include them in their submission. And this includes reporting all services received during the prevention plan, not just those in a 6-month window. Next slide.
Title IV prevention program data elements, specific population elements.
For candidates for entry into foster care, there are 3 additional elements we are collecting related to foster care status. Those are elements 13, 14, and 14A. Element 14 is, did the candidate enter foster care as defined in 45 CFR 1355.20 within 24 months of the prevention plan start date? So for candidates for entry into foster care, we are asking states to report on a candidate if they were in a prevention plan for any part of the reporting period, or if, as of the beginning of the reporting period, it has been less than 24 months since the prevention plan started. Next slide.
What to report and for how long. Pregnant or parenting youth example.
So we've created some visuals to hopefully make this a little bit clearer. In the above graphic, each gray box represents a 6-month data collection period. And the solid black line shows the start of the prevention plan and its duration. So for this particular example, we are going to look at a pregnant or parenting youth whose prevention plan started on January 1st, 2022. On April 1st, 2022, the agency would report services and costs from January 1st to March 31st. March 31st corresponding to the end of the first reporting period. On October 1st, the agency would report services and costs from January 1st to September 30th. Again, that's the end of the next reporting period. On April 1st, the agency would report services and costs from January 1st to December 31st, 2022, with December 31st representing the end of the 12-month prevention plan. And finally, heading into October 2023 and beyond, the child would no longer be in the reporting population and therefore would not be included. All right, next slide. looking now to see how it works for candidates for foster care, same prevention plan start date. Services and cost to report are similar here as the last example for the first 3 reporting periods. It runs from the prevention plan start date to either the end of the reporting period or 12 months from the prevention plan start date. What is different this time is that because they stay in the reporting population, they will continue to be included in future file submissions, and thus services and cost information is still reported. That being said, I want to note that the dates are not changing in the column anymore. You will notice that even though it is showing up in later file submissions, the end of the sort of the services and cost is always December 31st, 2022. Also, since 12 months after the prevention plan start date falls into the 3rd data file collection period, you would begin to report the foster care placement status at 12 months in the April 2023 submission. Finally, since this child does not enter foster care in this particular example, the elements related to entering foster care within 24 months would remain blank until the full 24 months has been exceeded. Next slide. So for this final example, we're going to do a candidate for foster care who does enter foster care and what that submission would look like. In this case, same prevention plan start date, January 1st, but in this case, they now enter foster care on July 1st. So now on April 1st, the agency would submit a record for the child with all services provided between the prevention plan start date and the end of the reporting period, as always. On October 1st, the agency would submit a record for the child with all services provided between the prevention plan start date and the date, or if there were multiple, the first date of entry into foster care. As a reminder, a child who has entered foster care would no longer be a candidate. And because of that, since we know the child has entered, the agency can now fill in items for 14 and 14A. They can now mark, yes, the child entered within 24 months of foster care, and they can provide a date. Moving forward, on April 1st, 2023, the agency would again submit a record for the file. The services information for the child would still be for services provided between January 1st and July 1st. Since it has now been 12 months since the prevention plan start date, element 13, which is the foster care status at 12 months, can now be answered. And foster care entry would still be filled in and updated for any additional entries to foster care that might have occurred. And as you can see, the record would stay in for longer until finally would exit the reporting population, in this case, starting on the October 1st, 2024 submission. Next slide. So turning back to sort of an overview of all of the data elements, these are all the ones that are in the revised technical bulletin #1, and that is a good source which provides more detail and formatting values and more detail on the reporting structure as a whole. So I recommend everyone, particularly the 49% who hasn't looked at it yet, take a look at it because there is a fair amount of clarification provided in there. So you can see we are requesting a certain number of data elements. We are collecting information on the report date and the agency. For agency, we are requesting state and territories use a 2-digit FIPS code, and for tribes, a 3-digit EPA code. And this matches the approach used in the upcoming revised AFCARS data collection. We are collecting child ID and demographic information for pregnant or parenting youth. The ID should match an existing AFCARS ID assigned to the child. And for candidates for entry into foster care, this should match their ID if they were to enter foster care. We are collecting whether the child is a pregnant or parenting youth or a candidate for entry to foster care. We are collecting the prevention plan start date. We are collecting a series of elements related to services and costs. These are elements 9A through 12. You can see here that type of service is split out into 3 separate elements, one for mental health, one for substance abuse prevention and treatment services, and one for in-home parent skill-based programs. These are all separate elements, and the agency is free to select all that apply for any given service. Finally, there's 3 questions related to foster care status that we've talked a little bit about before now. Next slide. The file submission will be an XML file. This is the same file format that is currently used for NIDed and is the same file format that is used for the upcoming revised AFCARS data collection. One of the advantages of an XML file versus a flat file is that we can avoid collecting the same information over and over again. Instead, it allows the data to be listed in a more natural, hierarchical, or structured manner. On the following slides, I'm going to show snippets of the XML schema and accompanying diagram to show how the data file is structured. Next slide, please. Okay. On the screen now, you can see the top level of the XML schema and a diagram of the same information. And the way to read the diagram is that the A file consists of a 4E agency code, a report date, and any number of records. And you can sort of see it's the any number because there's a 0 ... infinity, letting you know that we are expecting there could be with 0 records and there could be circular files with lots of records. But I guess the question is, what is a record? Next slide. A record corresponds to a child or youth in a prevention plan. Each child or youth will need its own record. And if a child or youth has received more than one prevention plan, each plan for that child would be a separate record. Each record consists of a child identifier, the values for the demographic variables, a response to the pregnant or parenting youth question, and a prevention plan start date. It also consists of a series of service information, and we'll do a little bit more on that in just a second. And it also consists of one response for element 13, which is foster care status at 12 months, one response for element 14, foster care entry in 24 months, and finally, a series of dates of entry into foster care. And again, to reiterate, these final elements are only applicable for candidates for entry into foster care. For pregnant or parenting youth, these elements are still listed in the file, but would have null values. All right, moving on to services, next slide. As part of each record, we collect information for each service provided. The service information we collect for each service is the type of service, the start and end date of the service, and the cost of service. I want to be clear that this information is to be specific to what was provided to the child or youth as part of this prevention plan. As such, the service start and end date should correspond to dates that fall within the plan. Likewise, costs should be specific to services provided to this particular child during the prevention plan. Now, each record can have any number of services. Again, there's a 0 to infinity. So it's possible for plans to have 0 records. And there's possible for children to receive many services as part of a single prevention plan. Next slide. And sort of finally, to round it out, element 14A allows for multiple dates or 0 dates of entry into foster care. Next slide. So to recap, file submissions are in XML, which allows for a nesting structure to the data. In particular, of note, I want to mention is that services are nested within records. Each record contains the information for a child or youth for a particular prevention plan. When a child has more than one prevention plan, they will have more than one record. Or, said differently, each record represents one child prevention plan combination. Next slide. Finally, I just wanted to point out that the Children's Bureau is working on a data system to collect the 4E prevention program data and AFCARS data based on sort of the revised rule. It's called the National Child Welfare Data Management System, or NCWDMS for short. And this is not the topic of this particular presentation. I'm sure you will hear more about it later. Okay, next slide. And I'm going to hand it over back to Jennifer now.
Okay, thanks, Malcolm, very much. That was a lot of information. And I'm going to ask you that hope that you will process that information. And if you have questions, please feel free to type into the question and answer feature. We prefer that. We'd rather it not be in the chat because we can more systematically monitor the question and answer feature, and then we will address your question either in on this webinar if we have time and we have the answer, or we will respond to it and make sure that it is made available to participants. You can also ask your question over the phone or live by using the raise the hand feature, which I confess is, oh, I do, I see it. It's the bottom where there's a hand. You can hit the raise the hand feature, and we will unmute you and you can ask your question. If you aren't on the webinar and have called in, you can dial *9 and that will signal up to us that you have a question, and we will unmute your line so you can ask the question. And then finally, if your questions don't come to you until later, or if you have questions to now and later, please feel free to direct questions about the data submission to the CB data team mailbox, and that email address is on the slide that you're looking at now. Before we get to questions though, we did have, as I said earlier, some questions in advance, and I'd like to share with you what those questions were, and I'll answer them now in case they might overlap with those that might be coming in. So if we can go to the, oh, we went to the next slide. The first question is about how to map specific programs to the types that are allowable in the data collection or specified in the data collection, those 3 categories. And we just have a few things to say about that. First and foremost, you should be guided by what you put in your plan, which means that you should select for the service the type that you identified in your plan that is associated with the service you're reporting on. We understand that individual children may be within a plan, or there may be the same service may be developed to children in the same household associated with different types, and that may be outlined in your plan. That's fine. You can note the appropriate type for the child who's receiving the service you are recording for that record. Also, we note, and Malcolm noted, that you can associate more than one type for a service. So if one service is being delivered with and is attached to 2 different categories of service, then it's fine to note that as well in the data submission as well. The schema allows for that. The second question, which we've heard a lot of variations of, is how do we handle reporting youth who have multiple prevention plans within a 12-month period, or 24-month period. Well, this, we have a schema that I'm going to show you in a second, but I just want to say a couple of things. This can happen for a couple of, for many reasons, but 2 reasons, or there are 2 primary reasons. One, a child might have consecutive plans because prevention plans are supposed to be 12 months long. And if a child or a candidate is in need for further services, there would be a subsequent consecutive plan. In that case, you would report the first plan and the plan which would end 12 months later, and then there'd be a subsequent plan and start date for the continued plan for that child. So there'd be a second record. That's what Malcolm was saying when he was saying there you record 1 child prevention plan record for each prevention plan a child is associated with. Secondly, a candidate may be in a plan that may end before the 12-month period ends because, say, they enter foster care, and then they may exit foster care and then resume candidate status and then be named in another plan. In that case, you would do the same thing. You would record a second plan for that candidate with the second start date attached to it. Can we go to the next visuals or the next slide so we have a visual of that? So this is sort of representing what I'm saying. So the green line is attached to the first prevention plan that's active for that candidate, the one that started January 1st, 2022. And it ends on December 31st, 2022. And the 4E agency determines that they would like to immediately initiate a second plan for that candidate. That plan would start on January 1st, 2023. and it would end on December 31st, 2023. So you would record both plans for that child. And the services delivered under each plan would be recorded associated with each specific plan. The thing that I do want to note is that there is an obligation for candidates to continue to report, as Malcolm just described earlier, those elements associated with their potential entry into foster care, elements 13, 14, and 14A. So for each of these child plan records, you would continue to report whether the child entered care within 12 months and whether they entered within 24 months and the date. So that does mean that there's a possibility that you would be reporting the same entry for a child attached to each distinct prevention plan child record combination. I'm going to stop there just to let that, that's a little bit complicated to say, but I want to make sure that I said it clearly. The second condition or the second circumstance in which there might be multiple plans for a single candidate is if, say, the green plan ended on December 31st, the candidate then did enter foster care, and that orange plan began at a later date. That's the second circumstance, but the same explanation that I just provided would apply. The records and services associated with the green plan would be submitted with the green plan. The subsequent plan and its start date, say it was later in the 2023 period, would then be reported for the subsequent plan for that candidate. Okay, I'm going to let that seep. If there are questions, we'll come back to them. I see that there are some questions, but I think I'm going to, unless my colleagues on the panel tell me that we have some follow-up that we should go to now, I'm going to go on to the next set of questions. Okay, can we go to the next question? We have had some questions about calculating cost. I just want to note and remind you that the legislation was very specific about wanting us, the Children's Bureau or the HHS, to collect costs on a per child basis, as well as a per service basis. And we do understand this, that 4E agencies and jurisdictions will have different ways of collecting cost information. And generally, I just want to note that we at the data team and our colleagues in OCAN are very, expect to and are happy to work on an individual basis with states to clarify with them the most appropriate way to report those costs. I do also want to note that there is no expectation that the cost data that you report as part of these data submission match what is on any 496 form, which is where you report your claims and expenditures. We understand that those two reporting requirements may overlap or may not, so there's no expectation that they match. A couple of other things about cost. We want to note, as Malcolm said, that in XML, the cost is reported for each service, not service type. So if you have multiple services for a candidate in a plan that are attached to a similar service type, you would report distinct costs for each service. And indeed, you report the service dates for each service. We also understand that multiple children on that have plans in the same household may be receiving services simultaneously. We understand that. We also are obligated to report on a per child basis. So we would advise you to allocate costs according to a method that you develop and can certainly review with us in order to get some tips or clarity on how to report those services. Similarly, we understand, and I think I'm going to get back to this in a second, that the service dates and the costs that are delivered and the services delivered within or across periods may raise questions about how to report those costs. And the similar, and again, our instructions to you are guided by what's in the legislation. but there's a lot of room for discussion and development of specific methods, which we would be happy to discuss with you. My overall suggestion is that you allocate the costs in a way that makes sense to the service delivery and the child in the plan for the period for which you're reporting. Can we just go back to that last question, because the second question on the last slide was, what does the Children's Bureau mean by the data file should be cumulative? And that means that for when you're reporting services that you, and I think, and Malcolm had a slide that sort of highlighted this, that you're reporting services, you're reporting all the services provided under the plan up to the point that you're reporting in the reporting period. That means that if a child began services in a prior reporting period and is still having those services in the current reporting period, all within a 12-month prevention plan, then you report all of the services delivered up until the end of the reporting period. So they're cumulative. However, once the prevention plan ends, then even if the services are ongoing, they, well, let me just talk about the cumulative part and we'll get to the cost part in a minute. However, once the prevention plan ends, you would not update any services provided because the prevention plan 12-month period is over, and you would report in subsequent reporting periods elements, if it's a candidate, that are relate to, if the child or if the service recipient was a candidate, you would report the services they received under the prevention plan itself, that 12-month period, and then simply or merely report the elements associated with their entry into foster care at the 12 and 24-month period. If it's helpful to go back to that graphic, we can do that, but I want to just get through, I think, one or two more questions, and then we'll see what is going on in the question and answer. And also, I would just note that if my colleagues at OCAN or in DIPME have anything to add to what I'm saying with respect to these questions, feel free to weigh in. How do we report services that cross prevention plans? That's what I was getting at a minute ago, and I just want to come back to that. We do understand, as we said before, that in some cases, candidates or pregnant parenting youth could receive services for multiple consecutive plans. The services themselves may start under one plan and continue under a next plan. As Malcolm said before, the way that we are asking for these data to be reported is that services must be reported within prevention plan 12-month boundaries. So an ongoing service, if a service was ongoing beyond the 12-month period, then you would enter a service end date that matches the 12-month period end date, and that ongoing service would get a new start date in the next prevention plan record. So the service date would end with the prevention, with the 12-month period end date, and the ongoing service would be sort of initiated in the next prevention plan with a date that matched the prevention plan start date. If, when you are reporting cost that crosses prevention plans, you would allocate the costs accordingly, looking with attention to when the service end date, when the service is ended with respect to reporting for the first prevention plan, it ended at the 12-month period, and you'd allocate costs up until that 12-month period ended, and then remaining costs, so for continued costs for continued services, would be associated with the next record. And I think there is a graphic, if we can go to the next slide, that is meant to visually portray what I just said. Again, you see the same green line at the top is the first active prevention plan that's active between January 1st and December 31st, 2022. And the second plan, which starts immediately afterwards, January 1st, 2023 through December 31st, 2023, that's the orange line. And then in the middle, you see that there is a service that began in the last quarter of 2022 and that continued into the next prevention plan that started on January 1st, 2023. In these cases, as I said before, this indicates that the portion of the services that were provided during the first prevention plan would be reported up until December 31st, 2022. And the remaining services that were provided with the orange plan would start on January 1st and continue through the completion of those services at the end, what looks like up right to the end of 2023. I'm going to pause there and check with my colleagues to see. I don't see the questions right now. I just see the slides, but I see that there are some questions. And let's take a look and see if what questions have been asked, and if there's anyone waiting on the line or in the meeting who'd like to ask a question.
Hey, Jennifer, there are no hands raised currently, but if someone would like to ask a question using their computer or over the phone, they're welcome to either use the raise hand function or hit *9 if they're on their phone, and we can unmute their line. There are looks about 20 questions currently submitted through the Q&A.
Okay.
And so.
Thanks, Phil. All right, I'm going to just start looking at the Q&A questions. I certainly invite my colleagues to turn on their cameras and off their mute and join me. I'll read the first question. How would you report if the candidates only receive services for 4 months of the 12 months? So you would report the prevention plan, you'd submit a record for when the prevention plan started for the candidate. Let's say this is a candidate. And then if they, I think that one way I'm interpreting the question is that there might be some period in the prevention plan where no services were provided at all. And as Malcolm indicated, that we anticipated that. Then if no services were delivered during that reporting period, you would not report anything for services because none were provided. In the next reporting period, if the services, let's say they were delivered towards the end of the prevention plan period, then you would record the service dates. The service start date would be when those services started in that 4-month window, and you continue to report them until the end of the 4-month window, unless it crossed into a new prevention plan. I don't think that's what you're asking, so I'll just answer it. I'll just leave it at that, but please let me know, Tracy, if that did not fully answer your question. All right. The next question, AFCARS does not collect 24 hours or less removals. Will this also apply to the prevention plan reporting? I don't know that we directly thought about that. I think that that is something that you could take up directly with a member of the data team if that circumstance arises. If a child, though, starts a prevention plan and within 20, I think, and enters care within 24 months, hours of that plan, I think that we would want to know that. But I'm going to say no more about that, and we'll get back and be more specific about that specific question. The next question, do we only report on a child if they meet the candidacy for foster care or pregnant parenting leave and received any of the approved foreign intervention services? Or do we only report on the child if they meet the candidacy for foster care or pregnant and parenting leave? This means that the services section of the data elements could all be answered no or be null, and the answer to that is yes. the second. If the prevention plan, if there is a prevention plan and services have not yet been provided, then you would not report anything for services, but you would report that there is a candidate who has a plan. For elements, I'm going to move on to the next question. Although if anyone whose question I'm answering has follow-up questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I have not seen anyone do. Okay. For element number 11, cost, would you expect to see the amount spent on the only the candidate child, or allocate the cost of services for the entire family to the child? Example, the family received parent skill building. There are 4 family members with only 1 child who's a candidate for care. The service cost is $10K for the entire family. So in the data submission, we expect to see $10K for that candidate child, or $2,500, which would be the fourth of the total cost. I want to not give an incorrect answer to that. What I will say is that generally, if services are provided to a parent on behalf of the candidate child, then those services would be, and the cost of those services would be reported for the all attached to that candidate child. So if those $10,000 of services were all for the parent, then they would be attached to the child, the candidate that qualifies the parents to receive those services. The thing that I want to confirm with my team, and we will get back to you on with a specific answer, is about the other 3 family members who are not candidates, but I think the same thing would apply. And if anyone on the
And hi, this is Liz Lovner from Policy, and I just want to interject and clarify there that, you know, I might feel more comfortable saying this than Jennifer, that might be why. We are looking at trying to collect information on the services that are being reimbursed under Title 4E prevention. So if your state is going to take all, I think they said 10,000 of that services provided, and say that it is a Title 4E prevention service provided on behalf of that child and claimable, then yes, that whole thing should be reported. If it's being, I mean, I know we're not getting into allocation and things like cost allocation, but if you're a state or a tribe and you know that, you know, 5,000 of that is just completely not being claimed to 4E, that wouldn't be reported in the reporting about the 4E prevention service. So what we really care about is the 4E prevention. And I do think that states will struggle on an individual level and probably need to work with their regional offices as they determine which of these costs are being reported here and for claiming purposes. So if you are a state that or tribe that is looking to have a lot of services that are just claimed for a family, but are identified with a child for 4E prevention, and you have that possibility coming up, really encourage you to reach out and make sure that everything's getting reported correctly and everything, because I think that those being anchored to that eligible child, if the services are on behalf of the child and they're going to be claimed for 4E prevention, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be reported as such here too.
Thanks, Liz, that is helpful.
Jennifer,
okay.
can I jump in really quickly with something?
Sure.
I know we had discussed it all. A lot of this information is sort of being clarified within revised technical bulletin number 1. I'm going to drop a link to it in the chat. But I also just want to note that Google is not doing us any favors, or other search engines. And if you search for Family First Technical Bulletin number 1, it's quite likely going to take you to the old revised bulletin. And I think right now it doesn't have an appropriate warning you that has been superseded within the landing page for it. So make sure when you are looking for the technical bulletin that you are going to revise technical bulletin number 1. And you should be able to see that there is the XML schema as another attachment in sort of the same landing page.
And it should have an August 2020 date on it, which is your which is when this revision was posted.
Okay. And I think I can answer a question related to sort of the service types. We know that the clearinghouse is approving the different services sort of under the different types, and a lot of them are dual or tri-listed. But what we are asking for as part of the data collection is when you wrote up a prevention plan for the child, you should be designating sort of what services and for what purpose. And based on sort of that, you should be saying that this is I've already forgot the type, mental health service or whatever. So it should be determined on the sort of a child prevention plan level, not just copying everything directly from the clearinghouse into the data submission, unless Liz is going to say something else. Because she just showed up.
I am. So you saw my face pop up.
Yep.
I want to clarify too that it's going to depend not only on how it was classified by the clearinghouse, but how the state in their 5-year prevention plan has elected that service. So that service might be listed as mental health and parent skills-based training or whatever in the clearinghouse. But if your state in their plan only elected it as a mental health service, then it's always going to be classified as a mental health service. And that's kind of getting into the weeds of that, but that's, I think, a really important clarification because there can be differences in the ways that you need to provide the information that you're providing about how it's being provided through your 4A prevention 5-year plan.
Thanks, Liz. All right, I'm going to keep going through the questions. There's a question. Once we have a candidate, will there be any data collection on the parent caregiver if they receive the prevention services? Not at this time. The prevention services are delivered on behalf of the candidate, and the information that we are collecting relates to the candidate who qualified the caregiver for the receipt of those services. The next question, implementation. Okay, so this question, I'm not going to read out loud. I think it requires to a specific circumstance in a specific jurisdiction. So I would advise the person asking this question, Rachel, one of the Rachels on the call. This is related to project delays and implementation delays, to reach out through the regional office to CB, and we will have a specific conversation on your circumstances so we can get you the answer to those questions. The next question, is it correct that the reporting timeline is driven by the maximum end date of the eligibility period? If a plan is from 1/1 to 12/31, but the services end by 3/1 of that, I just want some clarification. So if the plan is from 1/1 to 12/31, but the services end by 3/1, that is 3 months after the plan started, we would continue to report on the maximum time frame. That is true because we need to understand, because of these were services delivered to a candidate, then you would report only those services delivered in the first 3 months up until that candidate is no longer in the reporting population, which is 2 years after the plan starts. The information, I think one of Malcolm's earlier slides showed this, would not change because the services had ended, and we are interested in understanding whether that candidate entered foster care in 12 and 24 months. So you would still, if I'm understanding the question, then the answer is yes. If the services were delivered on behalf of a pregnant and parenting youth, then they would end, then you would report through the end of the 12-month period. Because of the elements related to foster care entry do not apply to that service recipient. But we do want to, well, you would report for the full 12 months, even though the services were delivered only in the first 3. On element 12, service end date, it stated that if the Title 40 prevention service is still being provided as of the end of the report period, please indicate not applicable. However, on the data constraint, it only has null as an option. Should there be a not applicable option? I'm going to turn this over to Malcolm. I think that's a very specific note, and Malcolm, we would just say no, right?
Right, yeah, we just need to clarify, and next time the technical bulletin gets revised, we'll clarify it there. That sort of null is the not applicable option for that one.
But thanks. The schema is precise, so we need to be precise in how we communicate about it. So yes, that would be no. On the website for the XML record format, is it technical bulletin? Oh, Malcolm, I think, is answering that question.
We answered that one already. I put the correct link in. It should be revised technical bulletin number 1.
Can you clarify if the cost of services per child is for the total cost for all services since the prevention plan start date? Do we provide cost for 6-month period for submission? I'm going to clarify and say it's cumulative, as are all the reports. So it would be for the full cost of services provided under the plan. So not a supplement to what was already provided if the child had received services in the prior reporting period, but that plus whatever the cost of services were for the subsequent reporting period. So it's cumulative. Do we have a validation tool available for this data? I'm going to let Malcolm answer that question, or ask him to. Ask him.
Yeah, so there's actually 2 answers to this. One of which is the XML schema is in and of itself sort of a validation tool. When you're extracting and sort of creating the actual XML file, it needs to conform to what the schema looks like. And obviously, if you end up running into troubles getting your data into that format, you obviously should reach out to us / the regional office to work out any sort of difficulties. The second answer to that is it is also expected that the Nicodemus system, the system you uploaded to, will also be able to perform validation before it's in any sort of officially submitted to us format. So there's 2 different ways you can sort of validate.
Thanks. What about multiple children, siblings, being served through a prevention plan for a service such as Safe Care, which is directed at the parent but involves all children? How does that get reflected in costs across each child prevention plan data report? So we do recognize that multiple children in a household could be receiving a service or parents service directed at the parent, as this question asks. But the way the law is written and the way the data is collection is structured is that you have to report on a child prevention plan unit. So multiple children in a household would still each have their own prevention plan child record. And the cost for those multiple children, if all of them are candidates, would get distributed across all the children in a plan. And that allocation method, as we've said, is something that we would be happy to work out with you if you have specific questions. And again, we would invite you to reach out to us for those kinds of questions through your regional office so that we can collectively respond to those kinds of questions, because we recognize that that circumstance just described is will not be a rare one. I'm confused by Jennifer's explanation and example. In the primary example, why would there be a brand new prevention plan when the circumstances have not changed? Instead, why wouldn't the original plan simply be approved to be extended? That I understand the question. We are guided by the legislation. I see Liz turned on her camera. The legislation, and Liz will tell me if she wants to add more or take over. The legislation is very specific. 12 prevention plans are 12 months. So if a plan, if at the conclusion of a 12-month period, the 4A agency determines that continued services are merited, then we would absolutely support. Then that is what, under those circumstances, there would be sort of a seamless transition to the next prevention plan. Is that
Yep, that's right. It's just how the law is written. The law is very specific, as you said, that it's a 12-month limit on services. And if you want to read more about how that works exactly, it's in our PI 1809 on page 3. Explains all of that. And that's how we can stay within the bounds of the law, yet still allow children to continue to receive needed prevention services funded by 4E.
On types of services, the data response is just yes, no. Is there a need to report the actual name or EDP used? Will that information be needed for monitoring and auditing purposes? The very short answer is there is, well, what you're reading it correctly. The data response is yes, no for each of the types. That is also consistent with what we initially said we were going to be collected. It is associated with the law. So at this point, the data response is just yes, no. We will know through your prevention plan what services services are provided under that particular type. And that will be one mechanism that we will be able to understand the relationship between what is being reported and what was being described in the plan. And I'll just make sure, I just want to ask if Liz or Kara have anything they want to add on that.
I don't have anything to add on that. I think that was a good explanation.
Okay, thanks. Okay, can you explain data element 11 for states that have submitted motivational interviewing as an EBP? Data element 11, Malcolm, is that the type?
Cost of service.
I'm not sure that I understand the question unless if you're saying that as practice, caseworkers working with candidates employ motivational interview techniques, which is an EDP, in the way that they are working with the candidate. I suspect that's what this means. And that is a good example of the kind of cost allocation decision-making that we strongly recommend you contact us through the regional offices to help you sort out. Unless anyone has anything to add, I'm going to go to the next question. I think Malcolm mentioned that it's up to the state to decide what types of given program. I think we actually answered this question. I think Malcolm answered and Liz clarified that we would want, that we understand that some of these services are approved for multiple types and that we would want you to report guided by what you proposed in your approved prevention plan. I don't know, I think I'm relying on my colleagues or the person who asked to speak up if I'm missing something now.
Hey, Jennifer, we do have one hand up. And I just want to remind our participants that if you would like to ask a question live, you can use the raise hand feature or on your phone, hit *9. Please also monitor your chat. We just want to chat to be sure that you've done that purposefully. So, Jennifer, if you're ready to take a question live, we can go ahead and unmute the participant.
Okay.
All right. So, Delma Bernier, excuse me. You can unmute your line if you'd like to ask a question live.
While she's doing that, Phil, can you go back to the slide that shows, I think it's slide 31.
Sure. That. There we go. This one, right?
Yes. Somebody asked for that, I think, to be shown again. And what I don't know if was it Velma you said who might have her hand raised?
Yeah, Delma, you're there we go. Go ahead, Delma. Oh, it looks like she's lowered her hand now, Jennifer.
Okay.
Okay.
We do have a lot of questions about cost. And I'm just going to read, so the slide is up again showing, I mean, some of the questions are about allocating costs across prevention plans. So this is a reminder of how to do that. What I said about costs, I'll just reiterate it, and is that we are obligated to report costs by service and by child. So within a report, within a prevention plan, which is at the child level, these specific services. And we do understand that there are many different scenarios in which a household, a family, a child may be one or more recipients of a particular service that's approved and being delivered as part of their 4E prevention program. We have guidelines that are the child, as I've said, the child that we have to know the cost of the child and service level, and that we would like the costs to be allocated to fit within prevention plan periods. So like this one shows that if the service process plans, then you would want to allocate the services delivered associated with each plan. In this case, you can see that maybe 20% of the services were in Plan A and 80% of the services were in Plan B, the orange plan. So you might allocate them that way. That's an example. There are lots of examples. We are acknowledging that there will be allocation methodologies and that they will be different across the states and tribes, and we are happy to help determine which one works best for you. The only other guideline is that we don't expect them, like I said, to match what's reported on the 496, which asks a different question. I understand that the complexities in the way these services are organized and delivered makes this explanation seem opaque, but those same complexities make it really different to give anything more than an opaque description, and our commitment to you to help you make a decision that meets our requirements and that works for the information that you have. So I'm going to just leave it at that and ask if there are other questions related to cost that don't seem to fall under the umbrella of what I just said, in which case we'd be glad to hear them. Otherwise, I think for the rest of the cost questions, that we acknowledge that we will be expecting to work closely with the jurisdictions to help make the decision that works for their program. So that is going to bring me to a question about the first submission. Oh, Malcolm, I see you turned your camera on.
I'm reading ahead through the questions. I thought there was something that might be worth answering, particularly while you're still in the cost section. But I think there may be some confusion for some participants about what we're asking to report under services, and we can say on this slide. If under a prevention plan, a child was receiving, let's say, motivational interviewing and brief strategic family therapy, each of those would be reported in its own section under service. So even though we wouldn't have an element saying it's motivational interviewing, you would still expect it to have an answer for 9A, B, or C, which in this case, motivational interviewing is for substance abuse program and services. So that would be yes. The others would be no. It would be the start and end date for motivational interviewing as provided on that prevention plan, and the cost specifically providing motivational interviewing for that child. Then there would be another service for brief strategic family therapy. And that is actually, it looks like, approved for mental health, substance use, and in-home parenting. So it could be any combination of those. Its start and end date and its cost for that child. So it's not being rolled up to mental health for each prevention plan. Each service should be its own sort of entry within that individual record. And if that doesn't make sense or doesn't clarify for the people who are asking questions related to that, just feel free to pop another question to the question and answers.
Okay, thanks, Malcolm. I'm scrolling through some of the remaining questions. I think you might have answered the one that's at the top of the queue with that comment. And just remind listeners that the way you classify a service should match what you reported or what you described in your approved plan. Here's a technical question I'm going to turn to. It reads like a logic problem, so we read it out loud. For our first submission, do we still report on any appropriate candidates that only have a new prevention plan start date in the first reporting period? Or do we include any candidates that fall under the reporting criteria but would have had a prevention plan that started before the first reporting period? I believe that we contemplated this and that we are leaving it to the states and tribes that if you have collected and are able to report on services and plans that might have begun before you're required to report, you are free to submit that data. You are not required to, but we would be glad to receive it. I think that's the question, but if that is not your, if I didn't respond to the actual question, please let me know. And that would be as the question noted, Kara noted, that would be mostly applicable or exclusively applicable to the first reporting period. How will the states be trained on how to capture the required data? I think I think this session is one example of how we're trying to provide information to states on how to capture the required data. I might turn this over. I might turn this over to Kara to see if she has other thoughts. I will say that we know that our TA partners have been actively developing resources to support states in the implementation of the prevention plans, and I think may also be poised to provide some technical assistance. We do know through, or I know through at least one of the webinars that I sat in on, that the jurisdictions will have, again, very different ways they are working with their service providers to either collect or have reported to them the data. So I think what we don't necessarily have a specific training plan for states right now, other than our willingness to work with them or work with them and our TA providers to help determine what in what ways states can capture the information necessary to report. Kara, can I ask if you have anything to add to that?
I don't have anything to add, but I do think if there are specific training needs that your jurisdiction is facing in regards to this data collection effort, if you could provide that information to your regional office specialist, we can work together to figure out what resources are out there and help connect you to the right support in order to ensure that you're successful.
Okay. Thanks. I'm smiling because I see that somebody helped me understand what was probably really obvious to everybody else. The point was that if a child is in out of home care for less than 24 hours, which is not, doesn't count really as a removal, how would that get reported in the prevention plan elements 13? And, or rather 13 and 14. So I think that's something that we're going to have to discuss and offer, and we will answer that specific question in a later communication so that everyone's clear on that. It's a good question, and thank you for clarifying it to me. Would we report a service for a parent that benefits multiple children? Do we report that parent in each child's record? The data collection does not require or even allow for any reporting about a parent or caregiver. So that is similar to other scenarios we've talked about. If a parent is receiving a service that benefits multiple candidates, then the services that are provided to the parent on behalf of the candidates are reported associated with the one or more candidates who qualifies the caregiver for that particular service.
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Russ, or whoever, could you advance to the resources slide? We're going to keep answering questions with our remaining time. I just wanted to make sure we had a chance to put sort of the resources up on screen so people could see the links for technical bulletin number 1 and 2 and things like that. That's all.
I think, and we will, we asked, there was a question about the slides being made available. I think, did that question get answered? And I think the answer is we will make them available. There's also on the next slide, which maybe Phil or Rush will advance in a second. This is the CB data team mailbox. And again, please copy the regional office on those inquiries so that they also know what you're asking about. I'm going to see what other questions right now we may not have yet addressed. Louisiana has the same question as Rachel Mercer, which I remember answering, but I don't remember what the question was. So I hope that we answered it. And if we didn't, when we answer it, we'll make everyone available when this, we'll make everyone aware of when we answer this question. I'm going to read this question and then we'll see if we can provide an answer in the time we have remaining. There's one family with 3 children receiving prevention services under a prevention plan. Say that plan starts 1/1/2021. Child 1 enters out-of-home care on 5/1 and is no longer considered a candidate. Child 1 returns home 7/1/21. Is that child considered a candidate again and resumes status within the original prevention plan, or does child 1 require a new prevention plan in order to become a candidate again? Liz.
I popped up. Yeah, this is more of a question about eligibility under Title 4E prevention than it is about reporting, I think. But to clarify, if the child enters out-of-home care, if they enter foster care, consistent with the definition of foster care, the federal definition of foster care, and they completely exit that candidate status and then come back in, they're going to need a new prevention plan to document their candidacy status a few months later. Because if they're becoming a candidate again, you have to redocument it. So if you think of the start of the prevention plan as sort of documenting their eligibility, I think it helps. That's the point at which you're documenting their eligibility.
Thanks, Liz.
I'll say again that if some of y'all maybe might not be as familiar with the 4E prevention rules, like you're more on the data side of things, that PI 1809, I think can be really helpful breaking down all of these complexities of the program. If you want to peruse that in your extra time.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. I just want to, I'm scrolling through a couple of the remaining questions. There's one very straightforward question about reporting non-4E, do we report services that are identified in the state's plan but not paid for by 4E? And I believe the answer to that is no. Liz? I'll verify that though.
Sorry, I was having trouble. So the question being, do we report services that are identified by the state's plan but not paid for by 4E? We're only concerned about 4E prevention services here. So if it's a service, I know states have submitted larger prevention plans that talks about sort of their universal prevention services and their shift towards prevention and all of that. But for this we only care about those 4E dollars. And that's why we want the cost of the 4E paid for services, is because this is all tied back to what the requirements in the statute are for what we have to collect and then report out.
Okay, there are a lot of remaining questions. And so,
I think there's one that I think probably worth addressing because it's a pretty quick one. In the case of multiple sequent prevention plans, what to do with the start date? Because we've already clarified that you're sort of supposed to end the services at the end of the first one and begin them in the second. In that case, you would use the new prevention plan start date as the beginning of the services too.
and there is one other question that is, if, oh wait, I lost the question. If services should be reported in multiple categories, should the cost be distributed between the categories? And the answer to that is that's not necessary because of the structure of the data. So the service is reported, and then you, the categories are reported under each for that service. So you would pick 1, 2, or 3, and then you report the cost for the service. So you're reporting the cost for the service, and there's no need to split it out in the categories because that the categories are reported under the service. And if you look back, the schema might make that answer a little bit more clear. So I do just want to stop now and just see if any of my colleagues, and you know, I did note at the beginning of the call that we had representation from OCAN and DIPME, the Division of Performance Measurement and Improvement on the call. We also obviously, evidently, have Liz Levner from our policy division, and we're very grateful for her to help us with responding to your questions. And all of those divisions will sort of huddle and make sure that we address any remaining questions and make them available to you along with these slides in the coming weeks, so that as you prepare for the required data submission associated with those who have approved plans, that we are supporting you in the ways that, in all the ways that we can. Kara, Liz, Malcolm, do you have any final words? Or do you have any final words?
I just appreciate everyone taking part of this today. I know how important this data collection effort is to states.
Okay, I think we'll be wrapping up. As I said, we will make sure that we have documented the remaining questions, and we will post them and make you all aware of where they can be accessed. And of course, we really do encourage you to sort of internally process this information that we shared today. Go back and look at the guidance Liz referred to, as well as the technical bulletins that have been recently posted. And please be in touch with us via our mailbox, loop in your regional office counterparts, and stay in touch. Thank you very much for your attention and your participation today.